The late afternoon sun streamed through the airport's massive windows as passengers hurried to catch their flights at JFK International Airport. Among them was a man in his early 40s, wearing a comfortable black hoodie, designer jeans, and limited edition sneakers. Despite his casual attire, he carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of building something from nothing. As the owner of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, he'd grown accustomed to traveling light. No flashy suits, no entourage, just his laptop bag and a small carry-on. He'd learned early in life that true power rarely needed to show off. His company was now valued at over $3 billion, but he still remembered the days of coding in his garage, surviving on ramen noodles and dreams. The boarding process for Flight 2417 to San Francisco had just begun. He approached the gate, boarding pass in hand, ready for the 6-hour journey ahead. He'd splurged on a first-class ticket, not for the luxury, but because he needed to finish reviewing some contracts before landing. The gate agent smiled warmly, scanned his ticket, and wished him a pleasant flight. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and leather seats greeted him as he stepped onto the plane. He walked through the first-class cabin, finding his window seat in the second row. As he stored his carry-on in the overhead compartment, a flight attendant appeared beside him, her expression shifting from professional to skeptical in an instant. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin. "I believe you might be in the wrong section. Economy boarding hasn't started yet." He took a slow, measured breath, the kind he'd learned to take over years of similar encounters. Without a word, he pulled out his boarding pass and held it up. The flight attendant barely glanced at it. "Sir, this is the first-class cabin," she repeated, louder this time. Other passengers were beginning to stare. "Could you please show me your boarding pass again?" He held it out once more, his face neutral but his heart racing with a familiar mix of frustration and resignation. The flight attendant took the pass this time, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny while other passengers, mostly in business suits, walked past them to their seats without any questioning. "There seems to be some confusion," she said, her tone growing increasingly hostile. "Could you please step aside while I verify this with the gate?" Around them, the first-class cabin had gone quiet. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones. One young woman a few rows back had begun recording the interaction on her smartphone, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "There's no confusion," he replied calmly, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "That's my assigned seat, as shown on my boarding pass, which you've now checked twice." The flight attendant's face hardened. "Sir, if you can't cooperate, I'll need to call security. This is a first-class cabin, and we have procedures we need to follow." A businessman across the aisle, who had boarded just moments before without any questioning, suddenly became very interested in his magazine. The recording passenger's phone continued to capture every moment, though she tried to be discreet about it. The flight attendant reached for her phone, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. He thought about his meeting tomorrow, a potential partnership worth millions. He thought about his team waiting in San Francisco. He thought about his daughter, who'd asked him just that morning when people would stop judging others by their appearance. What happened next would not only change his day, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond this first-class cabin. As the flight attendant dialed security, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone too, not to make a scene, but to make a difference. The story was just beginning, and nobody in that cabin, least of all the flight attendant, could have predicted how the next few hours would unfold. Sometimes the most powerful responses to prejudice don't come in the form of angry words or raised voices, but in quiet actions that spark lasting change. The cabin air felt thick with tension as footsteps approached from the rear of the plane. Security was coming, but they didn't know they were about to walk into a situation that would soon make headlines across the country. 2 airport security officers approached, their faces professional but uncertain as they took in the scene. The flight attendant immediately stepped toward them, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The first-class cabin remained unusually quiet, with only the soft hum of the airplane's ventilation system filling the air. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the taller officer said, his tone more questioning than commanding. He'd clearly noticed the passenger's calm demeanor and the expensive watch peeking out from under his hoodie sleeve. Of course, the passenger replied, gathering his laptop bag. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. But first, I'd like to make a quick call, if you don't mind. The flight attendant started to object, but he was already dialing. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Could you please connect me to the airline's chief of operations?" Yes, the same number as last month's corporate contract discussion. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly. The flight attendant's confident expression faltered as she watched him speak. A few passengers who had been pretending not to watch now looked up with open interest. "Hi, John," he continued, his voice warm but firm. "Yes, I'm actually on one of your planes right now, or at least I was trying to be." He paused, listening. "That's right, the same company that books about 2,000 flights with your airline every month. We're having a bit of a situation here." The security officers exchanged glances. The flight attendant's face had gone pale, her hand clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. More passengers had started recording now, sensing they were witnessing something significant. No need to hold up the flight," he said into the phone. "I'll step off and wait to speak with your team in person. But I think we need to have a serious conversation about staff training." He listened for a moment longer. "Yes, I'll wait in the terminal. Thank you, John." He turned to the security officers with a slight smile. "Shall we?" he asked, gesturing toward the exit. As he walked down the aisle, he held himself tall, his dignity intact. Several passengers shook their heads in disapproval, not at him, but at the situation he'd been put in. In the terminal, things moved quickly. Within minutes, several airline representatives in suits hurried toward him, their faces a mix of concern and embarrassment. The flight attendant had been called off the plane, and she stood a short distance away, her earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. "I don't want anyone fired," he said before the airline officials could speak. "That's not what this is about." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "What I want is change." The airline representatives listened intently as he shared his vision. He talked about training programs he'd seen work in other companies. He discussed how bias often operated unconsciously and how the right education could help people recognize and overcome it. As he spoke, even the flight attendant's tense shoulders began to relax slightly. "I'll tell you what," he said, pulling out his laptop. "I have some connections with top diversity training consultants. My company has used them for years. Let me show you their program." The airline officials gathered around as he opened his presentation. The same computer he planned to work on during the flight was now being used to design a solution. In the background, his original flight took off without him, but he hardly noticed. He was too focused on turning this moment of discrimination into an opportunity for transformation. "The thing is," he explained, scrolling through statistics and success stories, "when something like this happens, we have two choices. We can get angry and punitive, or we can use it as a catalyst for real change." He looked up at the group around him, including the flight attendant who now stood at the edge of the circle listening. "I've found that the second option, though harder, creates lasting impact." As the afternoon wore on, what had started as a humiliating incident was transforming into something unexpected, a masterclass in turning prejudice into progress. The flight attendant, who had begun the day by judging him, was now taking notes alongside her superiors, her face showing the first signs of understanding. Word of what was happening had already started spreading through social media, thanks to the passengers who had recorded the incident. But unlike many viral stories of discrimination, this one was about to take an unusual turn. The real story wasn't about what happened on the plane, it was about what happened next. The airline officials leaned in closer as he outlined his proposal for a comprehensive training program. Sometimes the most powerful way to fight discrimination isn't through confrontation, but through education. And sometimes the most meaningful revenge isn't revenge at all, it's creating change that ensures no one else has to experience what you did. The news spread like wildfire. By evening, videos of the incident had gone viral, with millions of views across social media platforms. But unlike typical viral videos of discrimination that usually end in anger and division, this story was different. People weren't just sharing the video of what happened on the plane, they were sharing what happened afterward. In the airport's executive conference room, the impromptu meeting had turned into something remarkable. The The tech billionaire had ordered coffee and sandwiches for everyone, creating an atmosphere more like a workshop than a confrontation. The flight attendant, who had been quietly sitting at the far end of the table, finally spoke up. She paused, her voice shaking slightly. I've never really thought about how these split-second judgments affect people. I just acted on autopilot, and that's the problem, isn't it? The businessman nodded encouragingly. That's exactly what these training programs help us understand. Our brains make quick judgments based on what we've been exposed to throughout our lives. The key is learning to pause and question those automatic responses. The airline's training director was rapidly taking notes on his laptop. But how do we make this kind of training stick? He asked. We've done diversity training before, but this feels different. The tech executive pulled up another presentation slide on his laptop. Because most training programs focus on rules and regulations, they tell people what not to do. What we need is to help people understand why these biases exist and how they impact real people's lives. He shared stories from his own journey, times when he had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, moments when his success was questioned simply because of his appearance. But he didn't tell these stories with bitterness. Instead, he used them to illustrate how small changes in perspective could make a huge difference. The flight attendant, who had been avoiding eye contact all afternoon, finally looked up. I keep thinking about my nephew, she said quietly. He's brilliant, wants to be a doctor. But sometimes he comes home frustrated because people underestimate him. I never connected the dots until now. The room fell silent for a moment. It was one thing to talk about bias in abstract terms. It was another to see how it affected people they cared about. The tech executive pulled out his phone and showed them something, a photo of his daughter's science project. She won first place, he said proudly. But at the science fair, 3 different people asked if she had help from her parents. They couldn't believe she did it herself. The airline's CEO, who had joined the meeting an hour earlier, leaned forward. What if we made this bigger than just our airline? He suggested. What if we set a new standard for the entire industry? The businessman's eyes lit up. He quickly opened a new document on his laptop and started typing. Think about it, he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Every day, millions of people fly. Every flight is an opportunity to either reinforce biases or break them down. The flight attendant raised her hand hesitantly. Could we include our stories in the training? The real ones, I mean. Not just statistics and PowerPoints. That's brilliant, the tech executive replied. Personal stories create emotional connections. They help people understand why this matters. As the afternoon turned into evening, the meeting had transformed into a brainstorming session. The flight attendant who had started the day by discriminating against a passenger was now actively contributing ideas for preventing similar incidents in the future. Someone ordered dinner as they continued working. The tech executive missed his meetings in San Francisco, but he didn't mind. Something more important was happening here. You know, he said, looking around the room, when I woke up this morning, I never thought I'd be here doing this. But sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best opportunities for change. The airline's social media team was already working on a statement, but it wasn't the usual corporate apology. Instead, they were announcing a groundbreaking new training initiative developed in real time with input from someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Outside the conference room, regular airport life continued. Planes took off and landed, passengers rushed to their gates, and flight attendants greeted travelers. But in that room, something extraordinary was happening. A moment of discrimination was being transformed into a movement for change. As night fell, the tech executive checked his phone. The video of the incident had been viewed millions of times, but now a new hashtag was trending. #ChangeTakesWings. People weren't just angry anymore, they were inspired. They were sharing their own stories and ideas for making things better. The flight attendant stayed until the very end of the meeting. Before leaving, she turned to the tech executive. Thank you, she said simply. Not for forgetting what happened, but for helping us learn from it. He smiled warmly. Sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't to tear people down, he replied. It's to help build them up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in an airport conference room, real change had taken its first flight. The next morning, the story took on a life of its own. News channels picked up the viral video, But they weren't just showing the discrimination, they were focusing on what happened afterward. The tech billionaire's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from other companies wanting to learn about his approach to handling discrimination. He sat in his hotel room, watching the coverage while sipping his morning coffee. The airline had booked him on their first flight to San Francisco the next day, but that wasn't the most interesting part. What caught his attention was the flood of emails from their employees worldwide. "I've been a flight attendant for 15 years, one message read. I've never felt comfortable speaking up about the biases I've seen. But after watching what happened yesterday, I feel like maybe things can actually change." His assistant called to reschedule his San Francisco meetings, but most of his business partners had already heard what happened. "Take the time you need," they told him. "What you're doing is more important than our meeting." The flight attendant from yesterday's incident had gone home and couldn't sleep. She spent the night reading similar stories online, stories she'd never paid attention to before. In the morning, she did something unexpected. She started writing about her experience. "I'd always thought I was one of the good ones," she wrote in what would later become part of the airline's training material. "But yesterday taught me that being good isn't just about avoiding being bad. It's about actively working to be better." Around 10 a.m., the airline's CEO called an emergency meeting with all department heads. The training program they'd discussed wasn't going to take months to implement. They were starting right away. The tech executive joined via video call, still in his hotel room. "Yesterday, we saw how quickly a bad situation can spread online," the CEO said. "But we also saw how quickly positive change can spread. Let's use that momentum." They set up a task force that included people from every level of the company, from baggage handlers to pilots. The flight attendant who'd caused the initial incident was invited to join. Some people questioned this decision, but the tech executive supported it completely. Who better to help prevent discrimination than someone who's learned firsthand how to overcome their own biases? He said during the video call. The flight attendant, sitting in the conference room, smiled gratefully. By afternoon, other airlines started calling. They'd seen the news and the positive response to how the situation was handled. They wanted to know more about the training program being developed. The tech executive's daughter called him during lunch break. "Dad, my teacher showed us the video in class today," she said excitedly. "We had a whole discussion about it. Even the kids who usually don't talk spoke up." He smiled, remembering their conversation from just days ago about people judging others by their appearance. "What did you think?" he asked. "I think you showed them that when someone's mean to you, you don't have to be mean back to win," she replied. "You can win by making things better." Meanwhile, the flight attendant had started her first training session with the new program. The room was packed. Crew members from other flights had come in on their day off to attend. They watched the viral video together, but this time they also watched what happened after. "The easy thing would have been to demand I lose my job," the flight attendant told her colleagues, her voice stronger now. "Instead, he showed me how to do my job better. That's the kind of change that lasts." During the afternoon session, they'd practiced scenarios, how to question their first impressions, how to handle situations with more awareness, how to turn uncomfortable moments into opportunities for growth. The tech executive's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a young entrepreneur. "Watched what you did yesterday. I've been afraid to wear my cultural clothes to business meetings. Today I did. Thank you for showing us how to be both successful and true to ourselves." By evening, the airline had announced their new initiative, Flying Beyond Bias. It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination, it was about creating a new culture in the skies. Other airlines were already signing up to be part of it. The flight attendant ended her day by writing another entry in what was becoming a journal of transformation. "Yesterday was the worst day of my career," she wrote. "Today might have been the most important." Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest growth. As the sun set, the tech executive finally headed to his rescheduled flight to San Francisco. At the gate, a different flight attendant recognized him. Instead of questioning his presence in first class, she smiled and said, "Thank you for teaching us all a better way." He settled into his seat, thinking about how one moment of discrimination had sparked a movement of change. His phone buzzed one last time. Another airline CEO wanting to talk about implementing similar training. He smiled, knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's creating a world where the thing that hurt you can't hurt anyone else. 1 week had passed since the incident, but its impact kept growing like ripples in a pond. The tech billionaire sat in his San Francisco office, looking out at the foggy bay while on a conference call with the airline's board of directors. The transformation happening was bigger than anyone had expected. "The numbers are incredible," the airline's training director was saying. "We've had a 98% voluntary sign-up rate for the new training program. People aren't just attending because they have to, they want to be there." The flight attendant from the incident had become an unexpected voice for change. She'd been invited to speak at crew meetings across the country, sharing her story with brutal honesty. "I'm not proud of what I did that day," she would tell them, "but I'm proud of what we're doing now." Their story had sparked conversations in places they never expected. Schools were asking for simplified versions of the training program to teach students about bias. Other companies, far beyond the airline industry, wanted to learn about their approach. The tech executive's phone lit up with a text from his daughter. She'd won another science fair, but this time something was different. "Nobody asked if my parents helped," she wrote. "They just asked about my project." In the airline's main training center, something remarkable was happening. The old diversity training videos, full of stiff acting and forced scenarios, had been replaced with real stories. The flight attendant's story was just one of many now. A ground crew member shared how he'd been mistaken for cleaning staff despite his supervisored uniform. A pilot told about passengers requesting a different flight when they saw her in the cockpit. But now, these weren't just stories of discrimination, they were lessons in how to do better. The tech executive received an email from a young businessman. "Wore my traditional clothes to an investor meeting today. Got the funding. Your story gave me the courage to be myself." During lunch, he watched new footage from the airline's training sessions. Crew members weren't just sitting and listening, they were actively engaging, sharing their own experiences, learning from each other. "Yesterday," one flight attendant said in the video, "I caught myself making assumptions about a passenger. But this time, I stopped. I thought about our training. It feels good to catch yourself getting better." The original flight attendant from the incident had started a blog about her journey. Week 2 of being a recovering discriminator, she wrote with honest humor, "Today I learned that growth isn't about pretending we're perfect. It's about admitting we're not and working to improve." The airline's customer service ratings had actually gone up. Passengers reported feeling more welcomed, more respected. The training wasn't just changing how staff treated people, it was changing how people felt about flying. Other airlines had started implementing similar programs. The competition wasn't about who could avoid discrimination anymore, it was about who could create the most inclusive environment. The tech executive's company had seen changes too. Employees felt more comfortable bringing their whole selves to work. Team meetings were more diverse, not just in how people looked, but in how they thought and expressed themselves. During an afternoon video call, the flight attendant shared something unexpected. "My nephew, the one who wants to be a doctor, he had his college interview yesterday. He told them about our training program, about how people can learn and change. They were impressed." Social media was still buzzing, but the hashtag had evolved. Hashtag #ChangeTakesWings had become hashtag #ChainKeepsFlying. People weren't just sharing the original story anymore, they were sharing their own stories of transformation. A message came in from a flight crew in Australia. "Started your training program today. Had a passenger thank us for making them feel seen. That's never happened before." The tech executive's assistant brought in the afternoon mail. Among the letters was a hand-drawn card from a third-grade class. "Thank you for showing us how to be kind," they wrote. "We learned that helping people learn is better than being mad." As evening approached, he received another call from the airline's CEO. "Remember how we thought this would take months to implement?" The CEO asked. "It's been a week, and we're already seeing changes in passenger feedback. People aren't just noticing what we're doing, they're feeling it." The flight attendant ended her day by adding another entry to her blog. "Someone asked me today if I regret what happened that day. I said yes and no. I regret my actions, but I'm grateful for where they led us. Sometimes our worst moments can inspire our best changes." In his office, the tech executive looked at his calendar for the next day. It was filled with meetings, not about technology or business deals, but about expanding the training program to more industries. He smiled, thinking about how one moment of discrimination had turned into a movement of transformation. His phone buzzed one last time that day. It was a message from a young student. "Watched your story in class. Today, someone made fun of my accent. Instead of getting angry, I remembered what you did. I offered to teach them about my culture. Now we're friends." The sun was setting over San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting better. And sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best changes in our world. 1 month after the incident, the story had grown beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The tech billionaire stood at the podium in a packed conference center, looking out at faces from every major airline in the country. But this wasn't just an airline industry event anymore. "When I walked onto that plane a month ago," he began, "I was just trying to get to a meeting. I never expected to be standing here today, talking to all of you about changing the way we see each other." The room was filled with leaders from hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and tech companies. They'd all come to learn about what the media had started calling the airport moment, how one incident of discrimination had sparked a nationwide movement for change. In the front row sat the flight attendant from that day, now a respected speaker on corporate change. She just finished telling her story to the crowd, earning a standing ovation not for what she did that day, but for what she'd done since. "Last week," she told the audience, "a passenger fell asleep and missed his connection. Before our training, we would have just rebooked him and moved on. But our gate agent sat with him, learned he was traveling to his father's funeral, and worked with other airlines to get him there on time." That's what happens when you start seeing people as people. The tech executive clicked to his next slide, showing messages from around the world. A small coffee shop in Seattle had trained its staff using their program. A hospital in Chicago had adapted it for healthcare workers. A school district in Texas had created a version for students. But the real story, he continued, isn't in these big numbers or fancy presentations. It's in the small moments that happen every day. He shared a video from a recent flight. A young boy was nervous about flying alone. Instead of just checking his ticket, the crew made him an honorary flight attendant for the day, complete with a little wing pin. His fear turned to joy as he helped serve snacks to passengers. The original flight attendant's blog had grown into a book deal. From Bias to Bridge Building would be published next month, with proceeds going to education programs in underserved communities. Advance copies had already sparked discussion groups in book clubs across the country. During the lunch break, attendees shared their own stories of change. A hotel manager told how they'd revamped their security protocols to be more respectful while maintaining safety. A restaurant owner described how their new training had improved not just customer service, but team relationships. The tech executive's daughter had started a club at her school called Wings of Change. Kids were learning about bias and inclusion through games and stories. Other schools were calling to ask how they could start their own clubs. Back at the conference, a retail CEO stood up during the Q&A session. "We implemented your training program last week," she said. "Yesterday, one of our security guards stopped himself from following a customer around the store. Instead, he welcomed them and asked if they needed help. They spent thousands of dollars and wrote us a thank you note." The flight attendant shared a story from her recent flights. "A passenger was struggling with their carry-on," she said. "Before, I might have made assumptions about why they were traveling. Now I just help. Turns out they were carrying medical supplies for their child. These are the moments where change happens." The tech executive's phone buzzed with a message from his team back in San Francisco. Their company's new hiring practices, inspired by the airport incident, had led to the most diverse and qualified group of applicants they'd ever seen. As afternoon sessions began, a video played showing changes across the country. A busy subway station where staff helped a confused tourist instead of dismissing them. A bank where employees learned to greet customers in multiple languages. A theme park where staff were trained to assist families with special needs children. The biggest surprise, the flight attendant told the crowd, isn't how much others have changed, it's how much I've changed. I see the world differently now. I see people differently. The tech executive shared recent data from the airline industry. Customer satisfaction was up. Employee retention had improved. Even on-time performance had gotten better because staff were communicating more effectively with each other and passengers. But here's what really matters, he said, showing a simple photograph. It was a young girl at an airport gate, wearing a pilot's cap and beaming at the camera. This is what happens when we stop letting bias limit people's dreams. The flight attendant stood up again, this time with tears in her eyes. My nephew got accepted to medical school, she announced. In his interview, he talked about how people can change, how one mistake can lead to a million right choices. As the conference wound down, people didn't rush to leave. They stayed, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, making plans to spread these changes further. The tech executive watched from the stage, thinking about how far they'd come from that day on the plane. His phone lit up with one last message from a flight crew in Tokyo. Used your training today. Had a passenger thank us for making them feel at home in a foreign country. That's what this is all about, isn't it? He smiled, knowing that what had started as a moment of discrimination had grown into a movement of transformation. Sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the best changes, not just for one person or one company, but for everyone who decides to be part of the solution. 6 months had passed since that fateful day on the plane. The tech billionaire stood at the window of his office, watching planes take off and land at the nearby airport. Each one carried crew members who had gone through the training program that started with his experience of discrimination. His phone buzzed with a notification. The flight attendant's book had just hit the bestseller list. From Bias to Bridge Building was being translated into 12 languages. Schools were using it to teach students about respect and understanding. You won't believe what happened today, read a new message from a flight attendant in London. A passenger came up to me and said, I read the book. I used to be scared of flying, but now I look forward to meeting your crew. That's when I knew we'd really made a difference. The airline industry had changed in ways nobody expected. Customer complaints were down by 60%. Employee satisfaction had reached record highs. Other industries were following their lead, creating their own versions of the training program. His daughter called during lunch. Dad, remember when I was scared to wear my science club shirt to school? She asked. Today, 3 girls in my class said they joined science club because of me, and nobody questioned if they could do it. The original flight attendant had just finished her 100th speaking engagement. She didn't just talk about that day anymore, she talked about all the days since. How learning from mistakes was more powerful than pretending to be perfect. Yesterday, she wrote in her latest blog post, I trained a group of new flight attendants. One of them asked me if I ever regret being that flight attendant from the viral video. I told them I regret my actions that day, but I'm proud to be part of the change that followed. The tech executive opened his email to find a message from a small-town diner owner. Started using your training materials last month. Today, a trucker told me it's the first place in 3 states where he felt welcome. That made my whole year. At airports across the country, something beautiful was happening. Crew members weren't just avoiding discrimination, they were actively creating moments of connection. A flight attendant learned basic phrases in 7 languages. A gate agent kept a notebook of local recommendations for lost tourists. A baggage handler started a program to help elderly passengers with their bags. The tech executive's company had changed too. Their offices became known for their inclusive culture. Job applications poured in from people who'd heard about their approach to handling bias. Success didn't just mean making money anymore, it meant making a difference. His phone lit up with another message, this time from a teacher in a rural school. Used your story in class today. A kid who usually gets picked on stood up and shared his experience. By the end, the whole class was talking about how to be kinder. Real change happens one classroom at a time. The flight attendant had started mentoring other airline employees who'd made similar mistakes. We're not here to shame anyone, she would say. We're here to show them a better way. During an evening video call, the airline's CEO shared some surprising news. Their training program had been nominated for a national award in corporate responsibility. But more importantly, their employees had started calling themselves bridge builders instead of just airline staff. Last week, the CEO said, one of our crews helped a passenger who missed his connection due to a panic attack. Instead of just rebooking him, they sat with him, helped him calm down, and made sure he felt safe before his next flight. That's not in any manual, that's just who we've become. The tech executive's daughter had given a speech at her school assembly. She didn't talk about her dad's success or money. She talked about how he turned a bad moment into a chance to help others. The whole school gave her a standing ovation. His phone buzzed one last time that evening, a message from someone he didn't expect. The airport security officer who had escorted him off the plane that day had gone through the training and become a trainer himself. "Thank you," the message read. "You showed us that the best response to bias isn't anger, it's education." Looking out at the sunset, the tech executive thought about how far they'd come. The viral video that started it all wasn't even in the top search results anymore. It had been replaced by thousands of stories of positive change. The flight attendant ended her latest blog post with words that summed up their journey. "6 months ago, I was the face of discrimination. Today, I'm part of the solution." Change isn't just about fixing what's wrong, it's about creating something better than we ever imagined. As night fell and the airport lights began to twinkle, he thought about all the lives touched by what happened that day. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. And sometimes true revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making sure nobody else has to experience what you did. The story that began with discrimination had become a story of transformation, not just for one airline or one industry, but for anyone who believed that change was possible. Because in the end, it wasn't about what happened on that plane. It was about what happened after, when people chose to learn instead of blame, to build instead of break, to rise by lifting others.